All right, everybody, I'm about to talk a little bit, an introduction to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is this week's movie. Just a fair warning, this is a topic I'm very interested in. In fact, I am sitting here. I'm going to tilt my camera down so you can see I have altogether, I think I have 15 or 16 books on Monty Python and the various members and stuff. So I will try to keep this short, but just fair warning. Let me put this mountain of books down. Anyhow, okay, so let me tell you a little bit about them. So again, the name of the group is Monty Python. They didn't start out to be a comedy group. It was just a TV show, but it was so popular in England that people began to refer to this group of people as Monty Python. And as I'll show you in a moment, the name itself really means nothing. It was just a silly name they came up with, and then it stuck. And like I said, they just thought they were going to work together in this one show and never work together again. But the history of the group really begins with somebody you already know, the English comedian and actor and writer, John Cleese. And like all these guys, they all started in college and none of them planned to be entertainers. He was training at Cambridge to be a lawyer. And I'll tell you what some of the others were training for in a moment. Like these guys, I mean, except for two of them, they're all still around. They're in their late 70s and 80s now. They're still performing, they still do stuff. The group is retired, but they are still active. In fact, I saw John Cleese a few years ago live in Jacksonville, and he's still on tour today. But anyway, they grew up in the 1940s and 50s, so during World War II and right after. And as I said in class the other day, he was one of those young guys that was very much influenced by the radio show, The Goon Show. They all talk about the influence of this show, even though, as I said, for most of us Americans, it just flies right over our heads. And he was very influenced by the Cambridge Footlights, that student group at Cambridge University. The other university is Oxford, by the way. They did do shows, but they didn't have kind of a set show like Cambridge did. So you never hear about the Oxford side. But that one show, Beyond the Fringe, which was the show done by students, including Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. And for anybody who knows, it's Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett are the other two. And they're also very famous in England. But for Americans, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore are the two that we usually know. This is the one that went to the West End in London and then went to Broadway and then became a book and became a movie and became an album. And so when John Cleese got to Cambridge to be a lawyer, he decided to join Cambridge Footlights. And just a couple of years after Beyond the Fringe, they did a show. I think the original name was A Clump of Plinths. Again, just a silly name, but they eventually changed it to Cambridge Circus. Um, and that also went to the West End and then played on Broadway. And it wasn't as big of a hit as the other one, but it was still a big hit. And John Cleese actually spent about a year in America. I think he worked for Time magazine for a while. He did a TV show and he did another play. And then he went back to London. But by this point, he was kind of a known guy. I mean, he was very young, but he was kind of a star. And so he did a lot of comedies on radio, like this one. I'm sorry, I'll read that again, which is just a collection of sketches and such. And you can still find it on YouTube and such. I mean, it's still available. He also did a lot of, he did a lot of writing of scripts and such. He did a lot of TV shows, and he was always, if he wasn't the lead, he was always the standout. So he had built a pretty good reputation. He was kind of on his way to being a star. Um, as I said the other day, they sometimes refer to this as the satire boom because for the first time, English comedians were beginning to kind of make fun of English society and politicians and the news. There was a show called That Was the Week That Was, created by a guy named David Frost. He's the guy on the bottom left. He was also a Cambridge Footlights guy. He actually later gets kind of serious. He actually became a real journalist. And this is him interviewing, for instance, Richard Nixon in a series of interviews in the 70s that were real famous. Until he died, he spent most of his life as a serious journalist. He started out as a comedian. And that was the week that was. And then this, the Frost Report, basically like the Daily Show or Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, where it's a fake news show making fun of the current news. And on this one, John Cleese was a writer and kind of, other than David Frost, kind of the star of the show. And he was then on another TV show, one that's not very well known today, called At Last, the 1948 show. And it was very popular. John Cleese starred with John Cleese starred with a guy named Graham Chapman. They had been in Cambridge together. They had been in that Cambridge show together. They wrote together. Chapman actually was a full-on medical doctor. He got his medical degree at Cambridge and actually was a practicing doctor. But like everybody else, he preferred show business. So, kind of working with John Cleese, he also did a lot of TV shows and did a lot of writing as well. So they were on that show, and it had a pretty big following. And the two of them were a fan of another TV show called Do Not Adjust Your Set, which was kind of a wacky, silly kids show, but it actually was more popular with college students and adults. And John Cleese and Graham Chapman loved the show. And then John Cleese was given the opportunity to have his own show on the BBC. And they said, you can pick anybody you want. And so he and Graham Chapman decided to work with several of the guys from this show. So they included Michael Palin, who was training to be a historian, his friend Terry Jones, also training to be a historian. They both went to Oxford. They worked with a guy named Eric Idle, who also went to Cambridge. He actually knew John Cleese already, so he was a Cambridge guy, worked in the footlights. And there also was an American named Terry Gilliam, who was an animator. And actually, oddly enough, John Cleese and Terry Gilliam had already met in New York a couple of years earlier. But Terry Gilliam did all these very weird cartoons. And so when they're doing a sketch and then they kind of don't know how to end it, they just switch to the cartoon. So it gives the show this very surreal, psychedelic feel. And I think it's probably more than anything else, is really kind of gives Monty Python it's kind of its ultimate look. It really does feel like no other kind of comedy show. And I think Terry Gilliam's cartoons are really the key here. So the guys I just went through, those are the members of what becomes known as Monty Python. So basically, it was these two shows kind of put together, became the show Monty Python. So they got together. So these guys wrote the show together. I mean, they would kind of, Eric Idle usually wrote alone. Cleese and Chapman usually wrote together, and Terry Jones and Michael Palin usually wrote together. But they would, share ideas and so they wrote collaboratively. And then they would get with Terry Gilliam and say, "Hey, we're ending this sketch. We need to get to this sketch. Come up with a cartoon for it." And then he would go off by himself and do that. And that was basically how they worked. As they were putting the show together, they had to come up with a name. And they, of course, being British comedians, they always like these real wacky names. And they had all kinds of names, Owl's Stretching Time, and a bunch of other silly names. But somebody came up with the idea of Monty. They thought we should name it after a person. So they thought Monty was a funny name. And then somebody else said Python, kind of implying like a sleazy agent. And then one of them said, how about circus? And then somebody else said flying circus. And eventually it just became Monty Python's Flying Circus. Again, it's a totally just fictional name, means nothing. There is nobody called Monty Python. And again, over time, they just become known as Monty Python and sometimes even just Python. And even the term Pythonesque is sometimes used to describe kind of a surreal comedy. A lot of things today are referred to as being very Pythonesque. So anyway, but like I said, they didn't realize it, but they were going to end up being attached together for the rest of their lives. They're always, whenever any of them are doing an interview, they always get asked about Monty Python. They ended up doing 4 seasons of the show, um, although Cleese actually quit before the 4th season. He decided they had had enough. But again, back then, British TV, they only did about 12 episodes per season. So they ended up doing about 30 something shows altogether between 69 and I think 73 was the end of the series. It was a huge hit in Britain, Scotland, England, Wales. But it didn't play in America. It was a half hour, but sometimes it was 40 minutes, sometimes it might be 28 minutes. No commercials. They don't do commercials on the BBC. And they were real strict about no censorship. So basically, no American TV show, because they have commercials and they censor, they wouldn't show it here. Eventually, it does get on PBS around 74, 75, and it becomes a pretty big hit. And that's how I always watched it. Of course, eventually it comes out on video and DVD and all that. But really, Americans knew it through PBS. Um, you know, that, And it wasn't a massive hit at first, but it was a cult hit. They had actually made a quick movie called And Now for Something Completely Different, which was a collection of the TV show sketches that they filmed for the movie. They played it in America, it bombed, nobody went to go see it. So again, it wasn't until it started playing on PBS that Americans began to recognize it. And then at that point, because it was already huge in England, now it was getting kind of big in America, but they were done making the show. They had gone on to do other stuff, but they all thought they started doing a live version of the show just to make a little money. But they kind of had the idea, why don't we make a movie, an original movie, and we'll call it Monty Python's whatever. And because we could play it in America this time. So that's what they ended up doing. Oh, sorry, these are just some of just the images of the cartoons that Terry Gilliam would do. And by the way, the Terry Gilliam cartoons, you can kind of tell already. He takes classical paintings and medieval drawings from books, and he cuts them out, and then then he adds his own stuff. So a lot of this stuff, like the foot, is very famous. You'll see this foot come down. And throughout the Holy Grail, again, a lot of that stuff comes from paintings. In fact, Henry VIII had a version of the Bible that I show in my US1 class, and it's only recently I realized that the image of God on that Bible is the image that Terry Gilliam uses in Holy Grail. Um, anyway, sorry. So these guys got together and decided to make a movie, and they decided to basically do King Arthur, sort of making fun of a lot of the movies. In fact, a lot of this movie is making fun of movies. Again, as you'll notice, it takes like 15 minutes for the credits to roll. So, a lot of it is just silly because they're British. So they're making fun of movies about medieval period, but they're also bringing in real history, and then they're also making fun of the history because again, some of them were historians. And so it's really a loose collection of sketches that kind of have a plot, and you'll see they all play different characters. I mean, there's some actual women in the movie, but they also play a lot of the women. And again, it does have that kind of dark silly humor that we talked about the other day. But this is the one most Americans tend to like. I don't think it's their best movie, but it's the one that almost everybody really does like. And it's just a coincidence because I've been a fan of this since I was a kid. And then when I started doing the Scotland program, and we actually went to a castle called Doom Castle, I kept going, wait a minute, that looks really familiar. And then I realized this is the castle from the movie. Um, and in fact, what's so funny is that when they started, they knew they were going to film in Scotland. Like, the whole movie's filmed in Scotland. And they were going to use all these different castles. Then Historic Scotland, which is like their National Park Service, they decided they didn't like the comedy. They thought it was too crude and mean. And they said it wasn't in character with castles, which is funny because castles were all about murder and torture and horrible things happening, you know. So Doom Castle at that point was privately owned. It's a castle that goes back to the 1300s, and it's pretty complete even today. Um, and now it's part of the National Historic Scotland, but it wasn't at that time. So they decided to just film the whole movie at this one castle, and they just filmed it from different angles. But if you ever go there, you're like, oh yeah, this is. By the way, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, this was used quite a bit in that show. If you know the show Outlander, this was also used in that, and it's been used in other movies as well. But it is most known for Monty Python. And it's funny if you go there today, you can get an audio tour by members of Monty Python. So now Historic Scotland has embraced Monty Python, but they didn't back in the 70s. Anyway, the movie was a pretty big hit, and it became a bigger hit on TV and on video and all that. I mean, about 15 years ago, Eric Idle turned it into a musical, and this musical has played right here in Quincy. I'm recording this in Quincy, Florida. It's played here at the local theater. I've seen it. I think Thomasville did it. Tallahassee's done it. So again, Monty Python has really become kind of mainstream American entertainment. And by the way, there's the poster for And Now for Something Completely Different, which I actually think is pretty good. But still, it was a bomb. And then after Holy Grail, they went on to make Life of Brian, which was kind of making fun of religious movies. I almost showed that one. I think that's actually their best movie, but it's a little, until you get used to them, it might not be it's not a good entry into their humor. Then their last movie was Meaning of Life. I actually don't like this one. I don't think it's very good. And that was really the last original thing they did. In between, they also did a Hollywood concert at the Hollywood Bowl, and they filmed it and turned that into a movie, and it's pretty good. But that's just a collection of their sketches. Again, throughout the 70s, they did a lot of albums. Um, But really, after 1983, they never really did anything. Let me go back to this real quick. Sorry. They never really did anything new again. They just did reunions and such. In '89, Graham Chapman died of cancer. Terry Jones died about 10 years ago of Alzheimer's. And so, really, with two members gone, they're never going to do an original thing. They did do a big reunion concert again about, I guess, about 10, 11 years, not too long before Terry Jones died. And it was a massive hit. And that was officially their farewell concert. But again, it was just a collection of sketches. It wasn't anything new. And again, like I said, the rest of them are still around. They're still doing stuff, but they're no longer performing as Monty Python. They did go on to influence a lot of comedy shows. Saturday Night Live didn't hide the fact that it was directly inspired by Monty Python. Second City TV, which is kind of the Canadian Saturday Night Live, people like Rick Moranis and John Candy, you might know, or from Catherine O'Hara. Kids in the Hall, another Canadian show, was very Python-esque. You guys might know Mr. Show from the 90s. Bob Odenkirk's a huge actor now. Even shows like Key and Peele. Recently, Michael Key wrote a book about comedy. And he talks directly about how much Monty Python influenced Jordan Peele and Michael Key in the Key and Peele show. And even shows like South Park and Family Guy. Not only are they kind of emulating some of that Terry Gilliam of style, but the quickness of it and the fact that they just jump from one thing to another without any, they don't care about plots and stuff. I mean, it's very Python-esque, filtered through American humor, if you will. And Terry Gilliam often used the foot to basically say, "That's it, we're done." And so that's me telling myself, "Shut up, you're done." All right. I hope you guys enjoy the movie, and I will see you guys next week.